And he says, some gay people are oppressed, but not all. And so that there's a sort of distinction that he would want to make between the two. And I mean, we could say that now. I mean, there's very many evil gay people. There's
Peter
many, right? I
Thiel,
mean,
Scott
right,
Besson,
there's a
like
lot
there's
of evil queer
plenty,
and even
plenty.
trans people.
Scott Wiener, yeah.
Right? We have the whole SF trans district and all that tomfoolery. There's a lot of nefariousness afoot. So, Nick, maybe you were sort of onto something right there.
What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
You might have guessed, when I was 14, didn't have a lot of friends, so I started some zines, the longest running one being this one, Little Green Men, which for those listening, I hold in my hands a copy, the final issue, number 4, Fall Winter 1998. It was a short story, sci-fi, fantasy, fiction zine, and I posted on boards online, and I wrote into other zines that offered free space to solicit submissions of art and writing and book reviews that went into Little Green Men. No one really asked, and so I didn't tell them the fact that I was 14, and most of these were adults that were writing for me and sending me these book reviews. But print media ended up being a lifeline for a young nerd such as I. I taught myself how to do graphic design, learn to edit and communicate a little bit more, openly with people who I didn't know all through the mail. I even designed some fonts, like mostly like pretty unusable headline fonts like this one here. And I look at zines and podcasts as like similar adjacent media. There's like a personal aspect to them. There is conversation being engaged between like the editor or the podcaster and the audience. And it's not one-sided like the more professional, I guess, magazines of the day back in the 90s. In 2025, the internet is becoming less and less usable. There's so many bots. I'm now having to click over to check if accounts are fake or not by seeing if they're, brand new and have next to no followers. And yesterday there was just a big internet outage because of one of the server monopolies that stores much of the internet. It went down, and I think that most people in charge of the world are stupid and cynical enough to just cut the most essential cables if we so much as threaten their power, which, as you know, is something we must inevitably do. So I think the timing of the sort of resurgence of print zines and media right now just makes sense. There's so many more zine conventions going on. People are reporting spending less time on social media for the first time since social media started. That is a long way to say that I am excited to have another print media obsessive, newer friend of mine who I know from Gay Shame, DeeDee, came all the way across the bridge from Oakland to film an episode in this very apartment where we talk about the first issue of a magazine that was published in the 1970s in the Bay Area. That was a tool for communication between leftist gays and trans people here and connected people outside the Bay Area eventually too. DeeDee is very good at this podcast thing, so I made her promise to come back and discuss more gay sunshine, maybe some other ephemera from the golden oldie days in the Bay when queer and trans media was having, I guess, its heyday. Pieces of media that I think are sort of bringers of hope that communication, it's going to continue even if the bastards at the very top bring the internet down with them. Thank you to Z and Joe for subscribing to the Patreon. Please, please, please go to patreon.com/sadfrancisco and join them if you can. there is a 99% chance that I will continue doing this podcast, regardless of whether some of you, support me financially or not. But do you really want to take that risk?
San Francisco.
Yes, here we are, live from Civic Center. DeeDee, we met through Gay Shame.
Yes.
And I am very stoked to talk to you about queer media from our past.
Yeah.
San Francisco past. A bit of an episode where we are time warping back to circa 1974.
1970, yeah.
1970 in the Bay, and looking through some of the zines that titled Gay Sunshine that you unearthed in one of the archives around the Bay.
Yeah.
You have like a pretty wider than my own knowledge of like some of this media that came out that sort of like can help us, give us like a picture of what trans queer life was like in the 70s here, and in the US more generally.
Hopefully.
Yeah. All right. So I asked you to like pull out some pieces. You picked some issues that like were particularly maybe just had interesting pieces, were like representative of, seemingly representative of what queers on the left, I would say, were like interested in talking about during this time.
Yeah.
And I'm like particularly interested in like what the similarities are gonna be. Like, are there similar villains? Are there similar archetypes of queers? What are the cliches that remain the same from the 1970s? I feel like right now I'm getting comfort from this. I need to figure out like a new way to say this, but like shit was like similarly bad in the 1970s. There were also a lot of problems that people were dealing with, and I don't know if it's a weird pessimistic maybe. It kind of hope, I guess.
Okay. Yeah.
That I draw on like this history. I mean, Miss Major, who I wrote the book with. Sorry, I'm going on for a long time, but I promise I will let you talk.
Setup. Yeah, setup. Context is important.
So Miss Major, like a few years ago, when all of this like trans queer media was sort of like coming up, it was like on the rise. It was like the trans tipping point in Time magazine with Laverne on the cover. It was like Pose, the show Pose.
Yes, indeed.
Like all of these like reality shows, all of this new media, like websites that were launched just around like queer and trans culture and politics, and Major noted like, oh, there's gonna be a backlash to this point in time. And that was a really helpful sort of point of view for me to prepare myself for a time like now when things feel like so regressive in culture and even in politics to a certain extent, even though politics has been shit for as long as I've been alive.
That's right.
In the US. But so just to start out, give people an idea of like where you're coming from, like where did you first like start getting interested in like queer trans media?
Okay, so I think it starts with getting into archival work in the first place, which I had the great fortune of starting at a very wretched university at the same time as a professor in the creative writing department there. And because she was just starting at the university, her name is Deborah Paredes, where most of the faculty were teaching almost entirely graduate courses and didn't teach a lot of mixed level grad courses. I think partially because she was new, and it would be even more lovely if it was something she just advocated for. Her class was cross-listed. And so I'd already kind of started writing like a certain brand of political poetry just coming out of high school, and trying to deal with those kind of political questions and things in a very constricted environment. And so I was ready to have an opportunity to feel that I was able to navigate that with some more historical perspective, because that's the only reason I went to that school in the first place, was to say, okay, I don't think that if I'm going to have to go to school, because I didn't want to go in the first place, if I'm going to have to go to school, I really want to go there and really learn something of it.
Yeah.
And so this archival poetry course. And so I was being introduced to the practice of looking at the past and looking at primary documents as a creative source, not just as like a dead thing or some kind of relic or you know, archaic kind of piece of material.
Yeah, potentially, some inspiration. And like these poems that you were mentioning in high school, was this like just for you? Was this like, did you put it out there on the internet? Can people find it?
No, you know, what was really funny is it had a lot to do, and honestly, it really feels very similar to some of the things that come up in these pages of Gay Sunshine, because it basically all started in terms of like the public presentation of it, because school that I went to, we had this tradition of lip syncing, and our class got in trouble, and it was always the seniors always had the most raucous, you know, kind of bacchanalic, you know, lewd, you know, as far as you could kind of stretch it kind of performance. And for whatever reason, and not even for whatever reason, many politics of race and sexuality in particular, it's kind of the Vine era. And so there are certain songs where, you know, it was only a snippet of the song that you would listen to. There would be some sort of dance towards it. And so we did that as like an interlude between our acts. And one of these kind of white feminist teachers went online and looked up the song and then saw the rest of the lyrics. Oh, this is so derogatory. This is so demeaning, da 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 da. We didn't play any of those lines. And it's kind of this, you know, policing of sexuality and expression, and this kind of that old hip hop debate of the 90s. You know,
Chipper Gore is a name that comes to mind. Who got the those labels on CDs in the 90s,
exactly,
like parental advisory.
Exactly, which just helped them sell more CDs, because then kids wanted to be like, oh, you know, it's like an R rating, you know? So then our grade got in a lot of trouble. And so I said that I would apologize on behalf of our class.
Wow.
And instead of apologizing, I did sort of a kind of lyric essay, poem response, speaking on the degree to which that kind of elite private school, college prep atmosphere creates such a particular sort of repression and angst that the way that it's then acted out, if you think that, you know, what was being shown on stage was unfathomable, what do you imagine we're doing behind closed doors, or like, you know, on the weekends with parties? And it was one of those schools where they had multiple issues in the years prior to when I was a senior, with people having like drunk driving and crashing, or like driving under the influence, or parties where people end up, you know, really sick or having a lot of trouble. And they just wanted to take no accountability. It was this sort of thing where it was just an open secret, I suppose. And so after that, they started instituting all these protocols and trying to change the way they looked at mental health and the pressures that they were putting on the students and everything. So it just kind of spiraled from there. I was like, okay, I can use these poems that I've mostly been writing in my journals, or using to process even my own position in school, kind of just like the token Black kid, and then it being so small, not really having a range of classmates that had, or at least felt they could express a range of sexualities. And so that's what's really nice about even looking at this, because like the focus on youth is really important, and youth having places to find themselves and like safely navigate these things, not assuming that they're just gonna get that in school.
Right.
So yeah, that's kind of the origins is in terms of the poetry, is that I was mostly using it to combat the rigidity and the repressive nature of the private college preparatory school I was at.
I love that. Yeah, we sounds like we both went to similar like little liberal arts schools. I went to Reed College in Portland, and yeah, I mean 1,500 students, very liberal sort of reputation, but when it comes to things like questioning is real, like there are some things you can't touch, and like the open secret thing, like people were ODing on campus, like more than I think was being seen at other schools. Like just look at the stats, but it wasn't a thing that was really being talked about. Yeah, interesting. So that's cool. So in terms of, sorry,
you wanted me to get to the queer and trans
yes,
part of the archives,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Okay, so from there, so that kind of had sparked this class, the archival poetry class. First sparked my interest in really working with archives and activating them in a certain kind of way and making them more public, to the point that I think there are many people who assume that you have to be an academic or have some type of scholarly position or affiliation to access archives, whether those be library archives for a public library or a public university or even private collections. But really, for the most part, you just have to make an online account and then be able to kind of rifle your way through the boxes.
Yeah.
And then send the requests, and then you show up, and then they walk you through what you need to know, and then you just go from there. And so I did also get
beauty of the internet.
Yeah, really the beauty of the internet, and the kind of beauty of I think librarianship being a pretty gay profession.
Yep.
And a focus and an insistence on publics and like public spaces. The American Library Association had the first queer and trans, or rainbow as they called it, kind of coalition. It was the first professional organization in the U.S. to have something like that. But anyway, digression. But go down the line, a few years later, after this archival poetry course, I had a fellowship, which was the Schomburg Mellon Research Fellowship at the Schomburg Library in Harlem. And it was an opportunity to try to do a kind of pre-professional thing for mostly Black students. My cohort was all Black, and they had been having trouble in the previous years, though, with issues of gender and sexuality, where they had some antagonisms among the cohort, and then even maybe with some of the scholars that they would bring in. We would have these daily kind of scholar seminars in the morning, and then we got to do research projects in the afternoon. And so they, I think, tried to curate an experience where, one, most of the people in the cohort, queer and trans, and then the archival survey and exhibit that they gave us to kind of get us interested and familiarize us with the archive included some of the letters from Joseph Beam, who's a real front runner in terms of gay publications, gay media, as a journalist. And
I feel like
also,
I should know this name.
Yeah, so journalist, and then also a anthologizer and editor. So you have the first collection, In the Life, and then you have the second collection, Brother to Brother, which is finished by Essex Hemphill, but started by Joseph Beam before he passed. And I remember really being floored by having the chance to, as you said, time warp and take a trip down into a moment that otherwise felt so grand and so spectacular that sometimes the intimacy of gathering and communion and this kind of work of getting an anthology into the world, or preserving all of this writing and preserving the kind of work that you and the people that you're building with are making, can get lost in the object itself. So even if people know the Brother to Brother anthology, they don't necessarily know the work that Joseph Beam was doing as a journalist trying to cover gay, and this is gay in a broad sense at the time, when it's still sort of an umbrella term, but gay life and gay culture as a journalist and writing to all these people and working across all these different lines. And then the emphasis even on engagement with lesbian organizing, because Barbara Smith relates in this interview that I want to say is on Millennials Are Killing Capitalism on the podcast. I think it's an episode with Dan Berger where they're talking about Radicalism Reconsidered, the anthology, where Barbara Smith mentions that Joseph Beam went to her to talk to her about putting together an anthology, because at that point, I want to say they'd already done Kitchen Table Press, which Barbara Smith helped found, had already done, already done This Bridge Called My Back. It's the edited anthology, and then also But Some of Us Are Brave, and I think it's All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, But Some of Us Are Brave, which is another really integral anthology. And so all that's going on, and that's my introduction, is that, you can learn, especially with the impact of AIDS on kind of the cultural institutions and the cultural fabric and landscape of Black, queer, and trans sociality and then cultural production, can feel often that at that time there was this big chasm to try to kind of get across temporally, and that there were legacies that seemed as though they were lost to history because of all of the death and all of the generally like state sacrifice and the state willingness to just let these people die. That seemed unrecoverable or unengageable, but then having this chance to look in the archives and see all that really made it, for me, a sort of imperative to continue that sort of work and just not stop there.
Yeah, I mean, well, I feel like we have all these social media clips like within what you just said. Beautiful. And yeah, I mean, it feels like we're returning to like a similar time. I mean, when all of, trans healthcare is being like demolished across the US, it's another sort of like health crisis similar to, in ways similar to what was going on in the 80s. I know it's a bit different, and maybe I shouldn't be saying this because I was not there, but of course we know that all of the rolling back, it's gonna lead people to, I hate saying the algo speak, the unaliving of many people, the like crushing the possibility for a lot of people, and the 80s are like back.
Yes, the 80s, but I think the thing that parts of the 80s are back. I think, right, the kind of state repression and the state sort of medical warfare and legal warfare is certainly continued and persisted. But part of what we'll get into as we proceed is that maybe in some ways many of the mechanisms and networks of life making aren't as present. And that's a part of what makes these texts so important to me and this material more broadly.
Right. Well, we were just talking about, like the closing in of like public space. I mean, in all of these ways, like I think what you're hinting at is, like there were more easy like ways into community back in the 70s, like the time that we're going to be talking about with these zines, and now it's less clear. Things are more mediated by screens.
Yes.
And it, I'm generalizing, but
right. But you also have to think about, okay, now if you have, say, a zine a newsletter, some form of media, you might put it online and you may try to use hashtags or trending dances or TikTok trends, right, to generate your circulation.
Totally.
But you have to think about and I know you've lived some of this, but to roll back, the clock more broadly, if you wanted your newsletter to circulate in the 70s, you couldn't just make it and then put it somewhere and hope it got around.
Right.
And so that's a part of the kind of community work of media that I think maybe sometimes gets taken for granted in a more digitally mediated time and place. Because it's one thing, and I've talked about this with some other people who are asking, well, what's the difference between what we do now with social media and what people were doing in, say, the early 20th century? The early 20th century with their newsletters or their pamphlets or their broadsheets and this and that. And I said in that conversation, well, for one, that was a particular time where you either had your own printing press, and so your publishing or your posting, as we would now think of it, you controlled your ability to post something.
Yeah.
And then two, you controlled your circulation of said thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you've basically seeded that, to do everything digitally mediated or to do everything on the internet broadly, and then apps more particularly, because there's these terms of service and terms of use on all of them. And then there's just regular policing and censorship that for those who are not particularly interested in using their platform to advance particular forms of politics, or even as you were just navigating, I hate to have to use kind of algorithm friendly language. Maybe some people just don't necessarily pay attention to, so they don't necessarily think about the difference between now and then. It's like, oh, but we're circulating our own independent media. Nothing that you're doing on the internet or a social media app is genuinely independent media. Yeah. Because even if you're not being funded by some legacy media corporation, your ability and means for that circulation is literally down to the State Department.
Yes.
So how independent do you really imagine yourself to be? And that really affects the kind of conversations you can have. And I think it deeply impacts the thought around building community around your media.
Yeah. No, I mean, even like with Gay Shame, we met through this group, like the website. I mean, Twitter is long gone because of, terms of service violations, supposedly. Just pissing off the wrong people. And then the website was taken down a while back because the group had targeted this local sort of gentrifier, landlord, sort of like neighborhood watch person. And she wasn't happy about that. And so she got the US-based company to take down the website. We were able to find, I think it's based in Iceland, I want to say, a host based in Iceland was, had fewer requirements as far as not naming names in terms of these sort of villains out there. And I mean, as a result, I think, there are a few places, but I guess even then, companies could use firewalls. Search engines could pull your results from their listings. So no, it's true. We're it is a different place that in some ways, because we don't have those community spaces that existed 50 years ago now, it is harder to distro things just through word of mouth, because people report having even fewer close connections with other people, and I keep talking about the male loneliness epidemic.
Oh,
like that's
gosh,
the
right,
thing
right.
that
That's
is.
the bar. That's the
I
bar.
feel like the drama of 2020s.
Okay, so I feel like a really good example is that there is a story that's recounted in one of the issues we're not looking at for today specifically, where one of the people from Gay Sunshine and who's involved in Berkeley Gay Liberation hitchhikes to University of Austin. Here in Austin, Texas, and this person mentions a story from Gay Sunshine. And this person who's there from Berkeley is like, "How do you know about Gay Sunshine? Like, what do you mean letter from Mary?" And the person says, "Oh yeah, I picked up a copy of Gay Sunshine when I was in San Francisco for NACHO, which is like the North American Conference of Homophile Organizations that had a conference in SF earlier in 1970, and that's the kind of chance spread that is driven by this sort of networking that in a place that I think that many of us would think today is aggressively repressive, and there's no way there would be a super robust gay liberation movement in Austin, Texas. It had one of the first gay liberation conferences was in Austin in 1971 in March, and much of the possibility for getting there is that those types of connections and having access to something like a Gay Sunshine, and specifically Gay Sunshine, that would just list all the gay liberation fronts that they knew and all the radical gay organizations that they knew at the back of this newsletter, and then have an address or a phone number you could contact. So then if you want to go ahead and then now have your conference, you say, "Hey, I got this phone number from the back of Gay Sunshine. I'm calling from Austin. We got our Gay Liberation Front, and we're trying to, have a Gay Liberation Front conference here. And this is X, Y, and Z that we have going on, and this is what we have planned. Do you think you could send somebody, et cetera, et cetera?" And there was so much motion in that particular period of time too. Like, the hitchhiking, the traveling on buses, and coordinating all those things, because you have all these movements happening at once. And there were just many people who were in gay liberation who were also involved with the New Left and involved with the anti-war movement, involved with especially the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention that the Panthers ended up having around the genocidal, holiday in November. They had regional planning conferences in the lead up to it. And from what comes up in these different issues in Gay Sunshine is that many gay liberationists were going to those conferences, the regional conferences, and meeting each other there, and then connecting the dots. And then many of them, whether they worked on a specifically gay liberation newsletter or just worked on an underground newsletter, would always try to keep these different contacts. And so then if they did decide, okay, we want to start up a specifically gay newsletter, they already had contacts from whether it's their time going to all these different marches on Washington or all of these different demos against the war, or you name the movement, being prepared and wanting to have an apparatus of communication that really felt like it was in their hands.
No, it is like, there's hope in that. Maybe like, okay, so this has worked in the past. This has existed in the past during a time when like people were doing some radical direct action around the country. Maybe the possibility exists for it to happen again.
Yes. One could hope.
Yes, and like media like this, is sort of like, opens up those possibilities by like connecting people, by communicating, helping people communicate across geographies. So let's talk a bit about Gay Sunshine, which I'm guessing, given the content of some of these articles, Gay Sunshine was a bit of an ironic title.
Yeah, a little bit. I would say it does have that kind of air to it, for sure.
I mean, it's like so it's dealing with racism. It's dealing with colonization. It's dealing with like sexism. It is dealing with transphobia. It is like At the same time, yeah, it's delivering it with some wits.
Yes, plenty humor,
That
plenty
the
camp.
yeah, queer and trans people, that is our thing. Maybe not so much myself, but I enjoy it. I admire it when other people who are funnier than me can string together words and make it, something to laugh at.
Our host is a bit modest, but that's all right.
Nope. But so how did you come upon Gay Sunshine specifically?
So Gay Sunshine came upon me. It illuminated my days or my nights, searching for particular gay periodicals for a study group that has grown out of gay shame, called Shattered Glass Study Group, which is sort of named as an homage to Stonewall and Compton's cafeteria, and street queens really fighting back and smashing windows, shattering glass. So I never want that to be lost. So that's where the name comes from. And it was the orientation and the vision for the study group is to bring us together to discuss queer and trans organizing history in particular, not just the cultural history, though they're never really things that can be disaggregated, but I think people often make that effort to disaggregate things when it comes to the political and the cultural life, especially if I think of Black trans women.
Right, the personal is political is something that I grew up on, like in zine world, Riot Girl in the 90s. It's like where I think I was probably first politicized.
Yeah, and I asked that question for many reasons with people, and that's definitely a question that comes up in Shattered Glass is, how did you come upon your politics? But Gay Sunshine. So essentially, one of the things we wanted to look at when I was talking to people about starting a group is trying to really get some more contextualization around the Compton's cafeteria riot, especially since it happens before Stonewall, but doesn't get the same kind of recognition and conversation because Compton's, I want to say, happens in 68. Stonewall happens 69. And
I think it's maybe 66.
66, even further back then. Yeah, and so I was trying to look at Vanguard, which was a publication for a youth, kind of like street youth, queer and trans, mostly street youth in San Francisco.
Yeah, I have some pictures of those kids.
Perfect, yeah. And who were around and who were organized, I want to say, in relation to some of the efforts that were happening with Clyde Memorial Church. And so Vanguard, also, they had a space to gather in that was kept open for them in the evenings. And, had support from the church for being able to, do things like publications and whatnot. And then there's other groups that kind of circulate in that period of time, like SIR, which is Society for Individual Rights, that was publishing Vector magazine. And so I was seeing these different newsletters and zines in terms of Vanguard and Vector, but I was really hoping that there would be something in one of those that really covered Compton's cafeteria riots in a particular kind of way, or was speaking to that sort of organizing. But even though Vanguard was involved with a lot of the efforts around Compton's, and I want to say like the cleanup efforts, especially things that were going on, it didn't really feel like there was a ton of coverage in that regard that really felt like it was speaking to what we were trying to do with the study group.
Like there were attempts to gentrify the Tenderloin in the 60s that are very similar to what you're seeing today in the 2020s. Yeah,
absolutely. And so I'm trying to process and work through all of that. And in the process of reading through Vanguard and Vector, this name comes up, Constantine Berlant. And I put it into Google and JSTOR. And Constantine Berlant was a UC Berkeley student who was in the areas at the time and was working as a journalist. Was working on, I think it's like the Daily Bear is the name for UC Berkeley's like main paper, at least was at the time. but then was also getting involved with all this gay liberation stuff. And one of the texts that came up with Constantine Berlant's name was Gay Sunshine. And so then, just put Gay Sunshine into the Googler, unfortunately. In a different day and age, I probably would have gone to the library, gone to the reference desk, asked, hey, if you ever checked it out, whatever. And I want to say UC Berkeley has a really robust online digital collection of various different queer and trans publications, especially ones that were rooted and published out of the Bay Area, but then California more broadly. So there's a ton of issues of The Ladder, the lesbian magazine that Lorraine Hansberry was writing to with pseudonyms and whatnot, expressing her own lesbian desires and things of that nature. Coverage of one of the first, kind of nationally recognized Black lesbian organizers, Ernestine Eckstein, that comes from Indiana, goes to New York, as many people were, trying to find themselves after college. Gets involved with Daughters of Bilitis, blah, 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 blah. So all of those types of things are just on, again, in terms of accessibility of archives. I just want people to walk away from this knowing how publicly accessible so much of this stuff is. That's why I'm kind of doing these digressions. But yeah, that's how I found it, was kind of going down the rabbit hole for the study group and landing on finding this person and just Googling. I would Google name by name of different authors who would have articles in these different publications and see if any real hits came back. And I think because Constantine Berlant was writing so regularly for these publications, Constantine Berlant's name pulled back a bunch of search results and ones that led to digital access links.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. I mean, fortunately, yeah, we do have a lot of this stuff still available to us, even as much as, the way that the current political moment feels like, so like it was kind of the beginnings of it were in things like the book bans and that you'd hear about in Florida, or like, the anti-critical ethnic studies, sort of like school board takeovers by the right wing that is still happening, till like, and now like, things like the Smithsonian, being too woke for the administration. The like getting like clamping down on information and clamping down on communication, like in the form of things like Gay Sunshine, zines, like really sort of resonating with the time. And okay, so we could try to maybe first describe the covers.
Yes.
Of Gay Sunshine.
I think in
for people who aren't watching and who are just listening.
Yeah. So the first cover is a sort of winged, fairy of sorts in the nude, in front of the sun, with these really lovely graphic renditions of sun rays and some flowers. Looks like maybe hibiscus flowers, and all of their bounty. And I think that much of what happens is throughout you kind of get this sense of, maybe it is mostly being run by gay men, which is often frequently does get addressed by some of the people who write in and whatnot. But there's a ton of pictures where, you're also in a moment where people are talking about the policing of the body and the refusal to have any type of expression. And so I think what you get and what many people have maybe seen from, whether it's posters from hippie or underground magazines of, the nudist colonies and just like this emphasis on a reverence for the body and a celebration of the body definitely gets is front and center in many of them. But then there also are issues where you're getting more of a traditional front page where you get a story and maybe you have a front page photo, such as when they're talking about these beatdowns at the stud And they've got, a picture of like a riot officer in full riot gear kind of trouncing on someone. But then, a lot of the other ones are these sort of expressions of a sort of fantastical and imaginative, sort of surreal, kind of gay, mostly gay men, I would say, kind of fantasies around certain like bodily expressions. Not a ton of like, variance in terms of size and, who is being represented in these images, which again gets brought up and addressed by many of the people who write in. But the thing I also did want to mention, I think, about Gay Sunshine being also sort of earnest too, and as much as it is ironic, is that there's a commentary that flows throughout the issues around being made to live your life in the dark and always being asked to express yourself only under the moonlight in some ways, and then even beyond that, only under the kind of dim lights of a club or a bar, and what that meant. And so I do think that there is some degree to which there is a desire to kind of buck the closet rhetoric and to more broadly pose the idea that you could be gay in the daytime.
Sunshine.
And so that is another portion of it.
As far as you can tell, like who's like illustrating, who's contributing. You mentioned that there was this person, Constantine Berlant. And but there's obviously like a lot of variance in terms of like illustrators.
So I mean, what they mention in some of the later issues in the submission statement and the submissions guidelines, and they cover it a tiny bit in the editorial statement in the first issue, is that most of the publication for Gay Sunshine is coming out of this commune that was moving across the Bay Area, started initially publishing in Berkeley, and then they end up moving and start publishing in San Francisco. And there's a number of pretty consistent writers and contributors. There's Nick Benton, who was the person who pens the first editorial statement and asks the question just outright, what's the value of a gay newspaper? Who was a divinity school student in Berkeley at the time. And I was joking with Tosh before this that there's like a lot of gay Catholics and a lot of gay clergy that played a particular role in the sociality and this making availability of space for many of these things. And then there's another person, Morgan Piney, who writes quite consistently. Jim Rankin, who's writing pretty consistently. There's Charles Thorpe, who plays a pretty critical role in Gay Sunshine being able to have the context that they end up having, in my opinion and in my read, because Charles Thorpe was a student at SF State when Gay Sunshine is taking off, and along with others helps found SF State's Gay Liberation Front, but then also helps to organize and be a very vocal advocate for the sunshine and being able to live your gay life in the daytime, and also helps host this National Student Gay Liberation Front conference in August of 1970. And so you could kind of see between the first issue, that's the August-September issue, and then the next issue, that's the October 1970 issue, the breadth of contributors really spreads. And so you're starting to already get contributions from people in different states by the time you get to the second issue. And so, cool. Quite the range.
Right on. Okay, so maybe we could start with this Nick Benton piece.
Yes.
That asks what is
the value? Like, who needs it? I mean, I would be interested to hear your take, since you obviously are part of Gay Shame and then also host San Francisco. What do you think is the value of something like a gay newspaper or gay media?
Yeah, I mean, for any kind of like quote unquote niche, like the ethnic media, I remember was like a big thing growing up, where I, as somebody who wanted so much to be part of like the hegemonic like the overarching hegemonic culture kind of like spurned, but like without, you know, Spanish language newspapers in Southern California when I was growing up, without like you know, Vietnamese newspapers, without like all of these different media outlets, including the gay stuff that was like it was meeting needs that were not being fulfilled by the like bigger media, the mainstream media, the corporate media. I mean, we have both worked a bit in the like you know, somewhat more traditional media world, I suppose. And yeah, I mean, queer and trans shit generally not addressed. Why we've always had to like create alternate forms. And I mean, today I'm like, we still have a few of those, like once like queer trans people had gained enough power, there was like a sort of like co-optation of the space that had been filled by things like Gay Sunshine. And so like you then had, I mean, I'm sure like so many journalists and columnists at the major newspapers were actually queer, trans, gay, you know, like they just weren't out about it. Right. But then, yeah, these mainstream outlets, corporate media outlets started to, you know, have those people be more public about where they were at, and where they were coming from. And so, I mean, it was like sort of impinging or whatever on the space, sort of treading on the space that these zines, magazines, these publications like had been filling for a long time. And so, I mean, we still do have, I mean, I know that people are making zines. Yes. For sure. Like there's like a resurgence in zines. I think it might be the Zine Fest this weekend. You met people from Gay Shame at like the Anarchist Book Fair, which of course is like
that
huge.
Was my first in-person touch point for Gay Shame.
Yeah, that's coming up again. We'll be back. It's, you know, a lot of it is books, but a lot of it is zines as well. And yeah, it feels like as even though we have like whatever, The Advocate and Out Magazine, there's them, which is
right, Condé Nast,
which, you know, I guess like Vogue is probably their most famous outlet. Like they run them, and I've published at them, and they've, you know, been like pretty open. I've published actually a little bit about Vanguard there.
Perfect.
But it's still, you know, it's I would guess they have like 3 full-time editorial staff, if that. And, you know, so it's only going to catch like a small breadth of what's going on. You also still have like a few publications from this time. I think Ultraviolet, Sinister Wisdom, these like, I would say mostly dyke-led publications that exist today that have been around for decades. I say there's only 3 people at them, but like 3 people can actually do a lot. In the case of some of these zines, like there's probably a lot of people who are connected to them, but a few people that are really holding it down to make sure that it's getting out on a regular basis.
Well, because they have a machine. You're still like a part of the Condé Nast machine. Even if your staff in particular is only one thing, they still have a certain visual identity that they're trying to maintain, a certain kind of style guidelines that they're trying to maintain. Yeah. So I feel like you still end up having that. But I think what you're saying when you say there's, 3 people can do quite a bit, it really depends on their engagement and their involvement. Because that's why this, to me, is such a robust example of the possibilities of, really people putting their heads together, putting a few nickels and pennies and dimes together to really get something going, because they were involved with the efforts to try to make different things happen. So much of the stuff that's covered in these pages come from their day-to-day activities, and it's the editors are organizers, the writers are organizers, and so many of the things are first-hand accounts or report backs or tips that were given after this or that action happened. I mean, there's even coverage of the White Horse, which I do find is now more frequently referred to as one of the last remaining lesbian bars in the Bay Area. But the White Horse Inn in the 60s to 70s was a gay bar more generally, and then was particularly a gay bar that was the site of picketing by Gay Sunshine, because the owners refused to let them sell the newspaper in there. And then also we're doing this whole, and they were talking about, at the time, of course, there's some things that have probably happened between now and then, but the owner at the time was always parading himself around as a cop, and would always try to flash this badge at patrons or would-be patrons. And there was all of those cabaret laws and liquor laws about not being able to sell to homosexuals, because the sickness and everything like that. Again, mix that sickness with alcohol and everything like that. So there was also, and maybe this is something that people wouldn't necessarily know about, but you couldn't touch in particular ways, slow dance, embrace in certain places if they didn't have the right licensing, which is maybe pretty hard to maybe wrap our heads around. And I haven't had a chance to really look deep into these cabaret laws and everything that having that or not having that entailed. But yeah, there was this whole big fuss about, not letting Gay Shame sell papers in there and advocate in that space because of all of these issues that could arise from them and the politics that were being represented. But yeah, I mean, the whole point of me bringing that up is that they're trying to create alternatives to it, and they're documenting it. So it's not just we're going to go cover that thing. It's we're in the midst of this thing, and we're going to document its happenings, and then reach out and try to see if we can find other people that, as you're bringing up with the kind of temporal connection, geographically trying to connect things. Are you going through the same BS and the same tomfoolery and shenanigans where you're organizing?
Yeah, super helpful. I mean, like just the discoursing that, a lot of these issues do remain the same.
Right.
Okay, so that's a little prelude to what does Nick say?
Well, I feel like he's very curious. And the reason I said he's very curious is he has this position where I want to say he says almost like verbatim that being homosexual is not a political identity, but being oppressed is. And he says, some gay people are oppressed, but not all. And so that there's a sort of distinction that he would want to make between the two. And I mean, we could say that now. I mean, there's very many evil gay people.
Peter Thiel, Scott Bessent.
There's a lot of evil queer and even trans people.
Scott Wiener.
Right. We have the whole SF trans district and all that tomfoolery. There's a lot of nefariousness afoot. So, Nick, maybe you were sort of onto something right there. But I mean, the question that sort of is asked in terms of what's the value of gay media, in particular in this case, a gay newspaper, is really a question of, what would you build around? What principles, what ethics, what topics, what themes are really central to cohering and coalescing a gay community, and looking at media as a part of community work, and community work as a part of making a circulability and dissemination and having things to write about and share and record a possibility. Because just as we were sort of getting at, you could have three people who really don't have much to say at all if it's just those three people hanging out and doing their, whatever they do just by themselves. Totally different thing if you have those three people who are embedded in, 300, 3,000, 3 million people because of the activities that they're engaged with. And so much of, I want to say, Nick Benton's contentions are to say that to really make it a possibility, you would have to expand your conceptions. And this is a sort of period in time where it's a year after Stonewall, and New York Gay Liberation Front has already started to come out. And even before Come Out, there was a newspaper called Gay Power that was coming out of New York. You have Gay Flames that's starting up out of New York. And of course, you have these various different underground newspapers. But Gay Power and what the gay liberation is really going to mean beyond a sort of adaptation and adoption of the language of the time is still really ill-defined. And so the thought is that one of the things that something such as Gay Sunshine could do is be a part of trying to give some sort of definitional coherence and a record of a lived rhetoric for people to be in touch with and to hold in their hands and to make being a part of that feel more tangible.
Yeah. And I know like the term discourse, I feel like has like a lot of baggage with it right
much
now.
Maligned now.
Yeah,
Yes,
totally.
yes.
But like, yeah, it's kind of this idea of like, all right, yeah, what are our shared values is like, as homos, like, what do we share? What are we trying to like fight against? Who are our ops? Like, I mean, yeah, straight out, there's like a piece. What's this shit?
Yeah, right.
And it ends with like, we poor fruits have not had, do not have any choice in the. So then there's like a bunch of superlatives.
Yes, things
off
that
the
probably
pigs,
wouldn't help with.
Off Honda, there must have been maybe a Honda boycott going on, I'm guessing.
Mm-hmm.
Off the oppressor politicos, gay power to gay people, gay power to gay people. So yeah, I mean, radical, very radical. And, they're talking about the straight capitalist daisy chain. And, like people who are staying in the closet, as, like kind of like needing to come out. Yeah, what else like struck you about like this first issue that like seemed to be like something that was really on people's minds at the time?
What strikes me is really going back to the naming of it in terms of Gay Sunshine, because already from the first issue you have this even international coverage. So even just by page 5, you have an entry from Seattle, you have a discussion about what was happening up at San Jose State, and then on that same page you also have a conversation about the Cuban Revolution and gay participation in the Venceremos brigades. And this is in a period in time, I want to say before or just around the same time that Cuba is issuing these different directorates and communiques in Granma, which still to this day is the paper of the Cuban Communist Party, and expressing and this is what they talk about, it's not an illegality, it wasn't illegal to be gay, but there were all these occupations that they found gay people were unfit to be in, and positions they found gay people unfit to be in at this particular point in time. But this insistence from gay liberationists that they wanted to see and really know beyond rhetorical persuasion and discourse and argumentation, what is socialism looking like on the ground, in some place that is close. It's not the Soviet Union, which is thousands and thousands of miles away. You can swim to Cuba from Florida if you had the stamina. You didn't have to worry about the Coast Guard. And so there is this breadth, and I think they're also dealing with a lot of topics that maybe, even as we're talking about the synergy or the interrelation between contemporary issues and contemporary questions in the 70s, you have this conversation about that sort of ageism that proliferates within gay spaces. So there's literally an article, again, like only a few pages in, called Older Gays, where they're having this conversation and asking this question. Do you all not think that you're going to grow old, and do you not have a concern for a certain intergenerational dynamic? And I don't know if it's in this particular article or another issue where there's another conversation about desirability among clubs and the bars and the cruising scene, and how older gay, and again, umbrella population is sort of just cast out of that.
Sure. Still a conversation.
But exactly. And this was how do we do this intergenerational gathering? But then also still grappling with the degree to which people who are maybe associate an older generation of gay with a Mattachine and a certain in homophile organizations, and more of a discourse towards trying to change the laws around touching and holding hands and employment. And the other important one was the DSM, getting homophilia and all that sort of stuff,
like being recognized by the system.
And getting the doctors to stop calling it a sickness and a disease.
Sure, yeah.
And wanting to be able to live their professional bourgeois lives.
Yeah.
And that being another association that older gays who are not of that ilk were having to contend with, in terms of why some of these groups would just kind of turn their nose up at them, besides a particular navigation of desire and
right politics that were like a bit more conservative perhaps, or a bit more formed around state
reformists and all that. Yes. So you already have these sorts of conversations happening, but then too you have an ad for Come Out newspaper. You see already from early on that sort of work, like the labor of communion and gathering that's already been happening before they're putting this paper out, that would allow them to have such broad coverage. This doesn't come across as a local newspaper and local newsletter, even from the beginning. Gay Sunshine clearly has a vision and an ethos of a sort of internationalism and a sort of kind of geographical unruliness that I really appreciate, especially in a sense of trying to break this sort of stranglehold of the coasts. And I do think that does help in some ways, because they're right not infrequently about how many people, as they would say, flock to San Francisco and make it possible to have contacts in these different places. So, you have somebody coming from some Midwestern town or some Southern town, or someplace maybe even on the East Coast that's a little bit more rural, who have contacts back home and are still trying to figure out what's going on, but felt that they needed to go to San Francisco or in LA or in New York, and then are helping with those degrees of connectivity. And then you also have them trying to shatter the walls. And so from the first issue, they're advertising that Gay Sunshine is free to prisoners. And they have writings there's this section, 5 years in Soledad, which is on page 7. It's someone writing in and talking about, what they're doing. And then there's another smaller subsection, just a page, or, on the other side of the page, connected to 5 years in Soledad, called Rip-Offs, which is RIP Offs. And they're talking about the policing, and especially the policing of trans women, and the queen tanks, and the general ways that a population under this gay umbrella that often does not actually appear in these gay liberation periodicals but as a footnote or an occasional interview when they've received enough complaints about the absence of trans people and especially trans women from their publication. You get something here or there. But for them to have that sort of breadth and dynamism and seemingly being really aware of a lot of the shortcomings and pitfalls of other publications and other dimensions of the movement, and even if they weren't able to totally liquidate or resolve those contradictions, as the language of the time would probably have been, trying to refuse them in the publication itself.
Yeah, like, not seeing what they wanted in these other outlets, and so making their own. And yeah, this idea of like being free to people who are inside, something that Ultraviolet, we've had DeeDee on the program before to talk about the Gay and Ultraviolet, like long-running newspaper that has always been like queer led and free to prisoners. So that, like kind of going with that idea of like bringing in people who are stuck inside at the moment.
We also have this coverage of Oakland, which I found to be really, again, a beautiful refusal of a particular stereotypical geography of gay life. Because even as they mentioned, there's an article called Fly Oakland. I wonder if the Oakland airport, I don't know when it opened, but I wonder if there's some degree of that's coming into it. But they basically tour a bunch of Oakland's gay bars, and I think at this point Oakland only has the White Horse left. So I always forget that it's right there on the Oakland Berkeley border. So there's still the White Horse, but there's a whole 8 gay bars listed. And I don't know if at any point in the time that I've been alive and lived in Oakland, there's been 8.
For
gay
sure.
bars open at the same time,
same.
And so that was a super beautiful thing for me to see. And then I've talked about this a little bit off air, but their discussion about communication syndicates and communication networks. So they're already inviting other gay newsletters and underground publications to be part of a communication syndicate and explain it. And so for people who might not be privy to that information, at the time you already have Liberation News Service and the Underground Press Syndicate, both of which are operating out of New York, is my understanding. I definitely know Liberation News Service is out of New York. Not as certain about Underground Press Syndicate, but both of them operating as these sort of newspaper clearinghouses for the underground presses and allowing people to be a part of their clipping list and their circulation lists and saying, I guess we can just read the questionnaire, maybe. That might be helpful for people.
Something that we need today, potentially.
Yeah.
We do have, indie media was sort of created with, I think, we can read into it, an adjacent sort of idea.
Yeah, so it's on page 9. There's the big advertisement for the Gay Switchboard, which is another thing we could talk about a tiny bit. It's right next to the Fly Oakland piece.
Yeah.
Got it. So essentially explaining that their comm syndicate is going to be modeled off of the Underground Press Syndicate, which was just mentioned. And they say, we're basically going to send out a form, and the form is going to have the following questions. 1, would you like to receive further mailings? 2, may we list your group in our mailing list? 3, will you put all groups on your mailing list to agree to do the same? 4, may all groups listed who receive your mailings reprint articles for their own publications. If your group does not get a mailing, or if you would like more information on this project, write to Gay Liberation Communications Syndicate, P.O. Box 4089, Berkeley, California, 94704. And that, to me, is really prescient and, again, speaks to this desire. One of the things I talk about with people about this particular time period is it seems people really wanted to be found
Mm-hmm.
and really emphasized being findable
Yeah.
in a way that in a much more algorithm content overload landscape is just much more difficult to manage and to navigate. You're trying to put the right hashtags on. You're trying not to post too many things that are going to get you shadow banned. You're trying to participate in things that are going to bump you up or boost you
Mm-hmm.
or get you eligible for ad revenue so that, you know, you're going to be pressed up higher in the feeds and
Right.
blah, 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 blah. Yeah, you weren't dealing with that in the same type of way.
Yeah, like there were, and I remember, I mean, in the 90s, there was things like Fact Sheet 5, like these
I've heard of that one.
they're like zines about zines, like just kind of, you know, zine, directories, basically. So like,
okay.
you know,
yeah.
they would have, you know, like just lists of queer zines. Sometimes they would review them, but each issue was like hundreds of pages of just zines, and you know that what you're talking about, like with like wanting to get found, like just thousands of people sending their zines to these zines that were directories of zines, in order to hopefully get the word out to a few more people.
So yeah, that seems really important. And then switchboards. I don't know to what extent. I asked my folks if they ever, you know, like called into any switchboards and things of that nature, and they said no, they hadn't, you know, had to, you know, participate in anything of that nature. It maybe had been phased out by the time they would really been making phone calls. But you know, during a period of time where you're trying to get particular forms of information, it seems the gay switchboard was going to operate in some ways like a library reference desk where you could call this particular phone number. It's going to be open during these particular hours, and for questions that you needed answers to around employment, around housing, around, especially they emphasized free things to do, public gatherings, other access to resources that you might find yourself wanting for. You could call this gay switchboard. And especially when it came to organizing the different meetings that was starting to really pick up, if a group didn't necessarily want to put the address that they were meeting into, you know, print, they might say, oh, hey, you know, just call the gay switchboard, we'll give you the address, which, you know, Gay Shame sometimes does with the Instagram post, like DM for the address.
Right.
So, you know, similar thinking, but, you know, with a much more breadth to it.
Right.
And
right.
you didn't have to be a nonprofit, you know.
Totally.
Without having to get that 501c3 or fiscal sponsor or any of this.
No, people just straight up, volunteering their time to do this.
Absolutely beautiful. So yeah, I think that's a lot of what stands out to me in that first issue, is the degree to which they're really trying to break down so many different walls and trying to have a really broad presence, trying to cover a lot of ground, but in a manner that's accessible without, you know, assuming that, you know, the kind of linguistic accessibility question. I think it's more of the, you know, like brevity of articles. And I do think that there's a strange way that length and attention is dealt with in our kind of contemporary day and age, where there's this idea, you know, like people just don't have the capacity to read or don't have the bandwidth to do so. But I think in terms of the layout design, in terms of the graphics that you were asking about, there is a very clear effort to make it be a very dynamic and living, breathing kind of material, not just a dead object.
Yeah. I mean, I'm always thinking about how like different forms of media maybe require more attention, you know, and but then like what you're absorbing from that media, like the TikTok that, you know, maybe 1 million people see, that's like immediately forgotten, versus the zine where somebody is like spending more time like flipping through it. It's like tactile. It's like you're spending the time with the text in a way that you're not when you're scrolling. I'm always like, yeah, that's something that's so interesting to me as somebody who's like more recently trying different forms of media with like the podcast and having been more the type of person who's writing 2,000 word articles, like journalistic voice a few years ago, and now is trying some social media. But also want to hear about like some of the glossary terms for words that were very popular who knows how popular that they were, but like some of the terms within the community that people were using.
Yeah, so I mean, at the back of, and this is not uncommon for other underground publications. I would say it feels not as uncommon with the gay underground publications. I cannot say that I find it to always be happening with the general underground press that was coming out of the New Left and the anti-war movement is having a section at the back of each issue, and it's titled Gay Switchboard. And so what they already were doing, even from the first issue, was having a section where they had organizations, jobs, needs, events, and announcements. And so in there, you're dealing with, again, having all these just resources at your fingertips and at your hands, where anyone who is coming to the area, anyone who's been in the area for a long while, is feeling isolated, is feeling alienated, is looking for an alternative to the bars, as we'll get into, has access to what they might need literally at their fingertips. And then it starts to expand. So different issues then go on to have sections such as fun, which is advertising the various different, again, mostly free or ad hoc or low price, or, now you have the acronym that sometimes people use because, again, you're dealing with the algorithm, but no one turned away for lack of funds, or NAFLA or whatnot. But they're already doing that then. Or, if you had the means, because you're one of these, Lord forbid, real estate or like land developers come up in here when they tried to make basically a gay commune in the Alpine country out here. But if you have some of these people, or you have some people who may be engaged with some of them, and so you have a little bit more money in your pocket, or as you were saying, you get those people who are more closeted but are working in particular jobs and then do what they do in the nighttime outside of the sunshine, like we might ask you to pay. So they have those sorts of things going on, but they're constantly trying to, again, make themselves findable and then also make it easy for other people to be found. And part of what they talk about is, if you believe in a gay community, make it real. And there's this insistence that the club and bar scene is not genuinely gay community. And I do think about that sometimes, because especially when COVID first began and as it's continued on, an emphasis on nightlife, I think, has brought some compromises among groups that find that to be maybe this a particularly exemplary expression of queer and trans life. And while there have been some spaces that have tried to insist on a sort of COVID spacer approach to gathering, I think many more, unfortunately, have thrown it to the wayside have emphasized the necessity and the need to escape in some ways, and to have that sort of release, put it above, making safer spaces and trying to ensure that disability justice and this sort of medical warfare does not take up major occupancy within the spaces that we're trying to cultivate. And we were kind of getting at this earlier when we were talking about the doctors and the homophile engagement with them, and how the medical establishment played a particular role in the legislation and the restriction and repression of,
Right.
you know, an umbrella term, gay life. And
Yeah.
so to, I think, repeat some of those, I don't even know how to describe it, to repeat maybe some of that callousness, callousness and to be, you know, going with a particular, siding with this sort of medical establishment that has said many times they don't care if we live or die,
Sure.
feels very peculiar. And so I think to know that there has been this long insistence on finding other places to gather and to make sure people knew where those places were. You didn't have to just try to find out, you know, what the local gay bar, the closest gay bar to you was. You could pick up an issue of Gay Sunshine, and they would always have a vendor list of where you could pick it up. And then constantly talking about going to different campuses and even going to high schools and middle schools, because there's content in it that's like crosses, you know, age divides and is pertinent to all ages of people in queer and trans life, and making sure that it was directly accessible to them. Really, that's the beauty of having something that is so physical. And then I think too, when we were talking about like social media, another dimension of it is those public encounters. So say we're both sitting on a bus or sitting on BART or waiting around somewhere. If you're looking at media on your phone, I have no idea what you're looking at. And sometimes, you know, you may want that. But in another way, that is a part of, you know, community building, is being somewhere and seeing, you know, someone holding open a paper and it just has this big graphic like Gay Sunshine on the back.
Yeah.
You're like, what? Hey, like, what's that?
Right.
Can I see that? Or like, where'd you get that? And then that being another touch point where then, you know, that person or you go looking for it. And having grown up, I think that's another part about the archival piece. I think, you know, being like a Black trans dyke has not necessarily left me seeing myself often represented. And I know, talking with definitely other people in Gay Shame, we talk about, and even you and I, like the way media and representation works, where certainly we don't necessarily want that to be the end point, but recognizing the pertinence of being able to have those touch points, as we've been talking about throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I got to a point where I said, even if I don't necessarily need to find myself in the archives to know and to sort of ground my being, because I think the fact that I am here, because I don't have a certain amount of hubris, lets me know that there are many people like me who have preceded me, whether I can find a trace of them or not.
Mm-hmm.
But what still drives the insistence of doing the archival work is figuring out how people were trying to make a way. And there's a certain section in one of the issues that we didn't specifically look at for today, where they start to have a conversation that I think is happening maybe more contemporarily, where we went back to the personal is political, but saying, you know, if it is that we really want to make revolution, we have to actually not just fashion ourselves and cloak ourselves in a revolutionary rhetoric, but we have to start figuring out what is the labor of gathering and the certain kind of, you know, liberatory communion that we have to do beforehand to make these things possible. Because we're already seeing in these other, you know, countries that have already gone socialist, the way that queer and trans people are being treated. And so we already know that it's not going to just be, you know, we abolish capitalism and we abolish the nuclear family, which I think is getting more conversation now. There's all sorts of, you know, abolition of the family. I think it's like abolish the family. There's like a book about this.
Yep.
And it's not just an old conversation that you can trace back to, you know, Engels, but you have these real like insistences upon it during gay liberation. But saying, okay, if we are going to abolish the family and liquidate all of these sort of social bonds that have helped to reproduce this particular violent system that we live in today, what are we going to make in its stead? And it's so much of that I think comes out of these texts. You know, when we talk about, especially from like an anarchist lens, using every tool in the toolkit and everything that's at our disposal, and not just having one way. I think one of our ways of finding other ways and not feeling as though we have to reinvent the wheel is to look at the certain ways and then figure in, okay, if there are these shortcomings and where things are left out, and this is something we'll, you know, talk about the next time we revisit Gay Sunshine, and particularly this issue where Gay Sunshine is addressing the issue of having such a dearth of material around third world, you know, gay people and just trans people broadly, and it's like that not really being, I think this is a point where you really start to see that umbrella term of gay starting to splinter and, you know, like kind of just like fall to pieces.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, earlier, yeah, we were talking about with like, you know, Cuba and like looking at like, okay, this is communist country, but do you want to be out in this country? Do you want to be out in the US?
Yeah.
You know, that's a whole thing too. But yeah, we still have like pieces of that. Like, I feel like there are some people that you can't talk shit on China or Cuba. Like you can't, it's like beyond reproach. There's no critiquing of Cuba, and yeah, like obviously that is a problem in itself if like that's shut down immediately. So like, yeah, it is interesting to see like, okay, especially like, I mean, some of the failures too, like that's especially interesting to see, and in some cases they're laying it out here.
Like nothing is precious. Nothing is too precious to pose a question in these pages. And that feels really important. And there's a particular way that I think something that hasn't necessarily come out explicitly, but we've been talking about all the work that you have to do before you print something to actually have it be possible to have it circulate. It's like they talk about, you know, these rap groups and the consciousness raising sessions, so that, you know, even if you're saying we want to not necessarily feel as though we're censoring, or we want this to be any topic is something that you can address. I mean, there's even a section, and I guess it's YouTube so we can swear, but it's literally titled "How to Get Fucked and Like It," and it's, you know, like walking through how to prep, you know, to bottom really, and that is sitting there right alongside a conversation about, you know, what is our approach going to be to how we try to move beyond sort of adopted and appropriated and remixed rhetorics of the movements that we've been a part of in the broader movement, the New Left, Black Power, anti-war, anti-nuclear, environmental, all of these different things. How are we going to try to form and make this in our image? And I think that's another thing that's really important for me, is like the background in the arts and, you know, seeing myself as an art worker in particular. And that goes back to the kind of origins in archival poetry, is, you know, really trying to see how something is made, see what it takes to produce something, to bring something into the world. And if it is that a certain conversation is desired, making room for that conversation to be had in a particular type of way, and trying to build a certain kind of lingua franca that is not closed off, or is not, you know, like insular, but is constantly growing and expanding, I think is, you know, integral to that process. And I think this newsletter, honestly, of all of the ones that I've looked at, you know, trying to find stuff for the study group, feels so special because it is the first one that I found that specifically had a section on trans liberation, and is dealing and covering trans liberation in life, not just in New York City, but in cities across the country, and mentioning and making reference to organizations that are not just STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or even when they are making reference to STAR, they're talking about aspects of STAR's work that aren't always covered. So they're talking about STAR being at, a communist-led rally to free Angela Davis, and how they ended up having to fight back against some of the commies because they were, queen bashing and whatnot. So, I'm excited for when we have a chance to really get into that issue really closely, because I think that attention to what was happening at the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention continues to grow, not just from a perspective of thinking more about the strategies of the Black Panther Party and how they were approaching a question about, what would be their next thing after so much of the building of the party was happening around the Free Huey campaign, really aggressively, beyond just, the growth of the survival program. So much of their efforts to really expand the party were about trying to save Huey from being killed. And then the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention becomes a critical point from that. And as we kind of touched on before, there were just a lot of gay liberals that were at the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention regional conferences, and then at the conference itself that happens, where they talk about having their own brownstone, or they had, I guess maybe some of the gay liberation people from DC just already had a space and hosted. And so there are people coming from across the country, and they talk about, they're obviously coming from Berkeley, but they talk about people coming in from Louisville, Kentucky, and Tallahassee, Florida. And again, when people kind of fixate on this East Coast, West Coast, this sort of bi-coastal history and retelling of gay liberation, miss out on many of those places and the role that they had. And they talk about like some 150 to 200 people from various different gay liberation organizations being present at the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention, and what that means. And I think for it to have been around Howard, and for many of the Gay Liberation Front chapters to have kind of popped up around among campuses, that's definitely a place that I want to look into as well. Was there an HBCU? With all the complications of those politics and histories in, missionary and Baptist and, religious organizations and their funding and foundings, were there any gay liberation fronts that really grew out of any of those places?
Sure. Yeah. Obviously Glide, a few blocks from us, like we were talking about with Vanguard, why is that the place that offers like the possibility for a group like Vanguard to exist?
Good Christians.
So yeah, I guess we could leave people with a few words, perhaps.
Yes, I think one of the biggest things is I definitely want to figure out a way to make it so that people have easy access to the various different things that are going on. But I also would say that if it is that one particular event, or a name, or a person, not just putting them into Google, but trying to go to these maybe like more research-oriented search engines, something like a JSTOR, the ILS JSTOR, and the kind of restrictions around it. But one of the things that actually is maybe them trying to make their amends for, I want to say his name was Aaron Schwartz, who unalived himself and when he was facing like just an absurd, inordinate amount of years for trying to, proliferate a lot of this content in an open access manner. JSTOR has a subset of underground newspapers called Independent Voices. And so it's many of these underground newspapers that we were kind of referring to that are open access. So you don't need to have some institutional affiliation. So if you put in the name of, say, like a Marsha P. Johnson or Sylvia Rivera, or if you start to get more local and kind of know names of people that have come up in some of the circles that you're in or some of the things that you've been looking at, and then seeing if a gay publication or an underground publication arises. And then in terms of navigating search engines, having like key dates becomes really useful. And so in a lot of the work that I'll do in terms of trying to find stuff for the study group, and what has been helpful for other people, because as the study group has gone on, more people who are participants have been starting to do research and starting to share material that they're finding, which was always the goal. Using reference points, so especially in radical or like underground newspapers that are not explicitly gay liberation publications, almost inevitably 1970 June, you start to see them covering gay liberation if they weren't already, because that's when a lot of the first Christopher Street liberation marches were starting to happen across the country. And so there'll usually be some type of coverage of a march that happened or efforts to try to get a march together and the formation of a gay liberation front. And then, yeah, I mean, looking at Gay Sunshine, because Gay Sunshine, especially issues number 2 and issues number 5, have these national listings where they've got like East Coast, Midwest, South, and then West Coast, and then list the different states that they had contacts for or heard of or knew of a gay liberation front or some other type of radical gay venture.
Those get longer and longer.
And yeah, they get longer and longer. And then contact places, like contact the Lesbian Her Story Archives, send an email, see if they, are able to help you find, especially if you know like what you're interested in. You might not necessarily know the name of a person. If you send an email, and there's more and more, like one of the most robust and especially one of the best websites for one of these archives was a archive for queer and trans history in Kentucky. And so it's really allowing yourself to be open to where you might find something that will really open things up and make it possible. You can literally go online and any various search engine, put quotations specifically around the words that you want to be sure are verbatim in the answer or the options, that results that come up. So you can do like Kentucky in quotes, and you need to do it in all caps or lowercase. They're smart enough to figure it out now. And then Gay Liberation Front, again, in quotation marks. And it'll pull up anything that has both Kentucky and Gay Liberation Front, and you're likely to find some type of archive, some type of an oral history, because, the documentary that includes the Lesbian Her Story Archives called Not Just Passing Through, with someone who's in a participant and in the study group brought as material. And there's a section in there where Jewel Gomez just says, outright that she considers it to be a particular lesbian ethic to archive and to preserve history. And some people malign archiving in a maybe more dominant institutional sense as an obsession with their infiniteness and the idea that they'll last forever. But I think in a different kind of way, it can also be about the ephemerality and the preciousness and understanding that, some of the things that we might be a part of will not actually last forever, but might be the seeds for something else. And so I think having that openness, having that curiosity, and call your library, again, like super, these very gay places.
Yeah, absolutely. And if people want, like, is Shatterglass open?
Yeah, because it's an all digital URL study group, as much as I've been talking about, getting, face-to-face, hand-to-hand, I think it's useful because of the severance of these sorts of networks. And as far as I know, the absence of things like a Liberation News Service or an Underground Press Syndicate or a Gay Liberation Comm Syndicate, that I think we're trying to do some of that rebuilding of those things. So having people that are in different places, it's really useful. And so meeting on Jitsi makes it possible to convene across geographies. And so, yeah, we meet Sundays, noon Pacific time. And even if you can't make it, we always send a recap of what we talked about, and we always, send the material so that you can look at it and peruse it on your own time. And are hoping to move towards, making a newsletter, or making, a more regular zine, so that people can, remotely contribute and share their thoughts on, what queer and trans liberation can look like today, and the lessons that they're learning and we're learning from studying this stuff. And again, just activating, making it, public archives, really bringing them out into the archives. The archives are alive.
Love it.
Thanks for having me. It's
Thank
been
you
lovely.
so much. So we're gonna have more Gay Sunshine.
We're gonna come back.
Sure. All right.
Thank you for listening to the show, and especially thank you to everyone who is contributing over at patreon.com/Sad Francisco. You're making it possible for Sad Francisco to exist. And if you're not already a member, think about joining. Again, it's patreon.com/Sad Francisco.